Welcome to Rewired Sober, the podcast that breaks down the real reasons women turn to alcohol. Spoiler alert, it wasn't a character flaw. It was your neurobiology, your conditioning, and the systems that taught women to silence themselves instead of support themselves. I'm your host, Kate Vitella. I've been a registered nurse for well over 2 decades, trained in addiction and mental health, a bit neuroscience obsessed, but spiritually grounded. This is the science and soul work of a woman's recovery, where I help you understand what's happening in your sober brain and reconnect to that deeper inner truth you've always had, that soul level knowing, the intuition the patriarchy has tried to train out of you. When women combine the science of the brain rewiring with that inner knowing, you stop feeling broken and you start feeling powerful. So let's get into it. Rewired Sober, welcome back. It is just me today doing a solo episode. I'm your host, Kate Vitella, and I want to talk about something that's sort of like when you're thinking of buying a yellow car, and then all of a sudden there are yellow cars everywhere. That's what's coming up for me. We're going to talk about cults today. Hang on, because this is going to get interesting. And sort of the impact of playing follow the leader, especially as a woman my age. I'm 46 years old. I'm almost 47. And I'm catching myself in patterns. And so, as you know, I've taped a few episodes on deprogramming, the dogma of 12-step programs, the dogma in a lot of areas of my life. And the more that I deprogrammed from AA, the more I realized I wasn't just untangling from one system. I was untangling from a pattern, my pattern, a pattern of following the leader, of mistaking certainty for safety and silencing my own gut instincts to stay accepted, to stay in the group. And once I saw the cult mentality, once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. And I saw it in one place in my life, and I started seeing it in multiple areas. Turns out cults are not always drinking the Kool-Aid and laying in bunk beds, right? I was trying to find some examples of famous cults. And of course, Charles Manson comes up in Waco, Texas. But sometimes it's a little bit more hidden than that. Sometimes it's buried in recovery programs, spiritual superiority and groupthink, even in friend circles or communities that will say they love you right up until you ask a question, right? So I want to talk about what I mean by cult. Not every high demand group is a cult, but more so like, let's talk about cult mentality, the dangers of that. Any group that starts getting culty, love that word because it sounds like cunty, but any group that starts getting culty when belonging depends on being obedient, and any kind of dissent is punished. And particularly when you start noticing your mental health declines because you are constantly overriding your own gut sense and your own reality. So these are often group dynamics that pressure people to conform and to suppress any suspicion or dissent. And there's this glorification of a leader or an ideology and the tendency to trade any kind of complexity or nuance for certainty. And like I've said before, what I'm deprogramming from 12-step is very black and white thinking, very loaded language. But also, like as a whole, there's this deprogramming of the fear of leaving and the fear of being wrong, and the dependency on the group for my identity, and fear of this like insider/outsider mentality. And with that comes so much shame and there's this personal instinct that gets overridden by this group think. And so you're questioning yourself. And this is really hard on your mental health. It was really hard on mine. Now, I'm stepping back from a little ways so I can talk about this, and I feel pretty good about it. But let's not gloss over how hard this can be on your mental health. There were days when I didn't feel like I could get out of bed, and I felt really depressed. And I called my mom several times. And so I want to talk about this, and I want to get a little bit more granular here. Like I said, I had the audacity to Google famous cults on my phone. So God knows what my social media feed is going to look like now. It's like I'm going to get ads for Kool-Aid or real estate properties in Utah. 1-800 if you're lonely, call this number. No, I'm kidding. Turns out there's no real single universally accepted, I love a clinical definition, right? Or there's no like legal definition of what a cult is. But that's part of the reason why we argue about the word so much. In a practice, experts look at patterns of authoritarian control, of coercive persuasion, and of thought reform, and not just whether a group is weird or insane. So it can be really hard to kind of talk about this where anyone's actually, quote, right. So I think one of the more useful ways to talk about this is framing it up as it can be a group or a relationship system that becomes authoritarian and controlling and demands loyalty. And I'm going to get into that, demanding loyalty, because that was big as well. Or discouraging or punishing any independent thinking, and uses behavior, thought, information as a form of emotional control to keep people dependent on the group leader or even the group. And a lot of the thought reform framework comes from the psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton, and he breaks it down into 8 common features we see in cults. So this is like an overriding commonality. Number 1, control of the environment or information. The group limits what members hear, read, discuss, or question, right? Like literature you're reading, input you're receiving. Number 2, mystical manipulation. The leader or system frames events as spiritually or cosmically significant to reinforce authority. Number 3, a demand for purity. Life gets split into pure versus impure, right versus wrong. You're either in or you're out. Number 4, confession. People are pushed in this group to expose their doubts, their sins, their defects, or their weaknesses, which can then be used to regulate them. I don't even know what number I'm on. 5, sacred science. Okay, in a cult, the doctrine is treated as the, quote, final truth, and they're not open to real challenges of this sacred science at all. Number 6, loaded language. The group will rely on shorthand slogans and jargon that will shut down any complex thinking. And then 7, doctrine over person. Your lived experience in a cult gets overridden by the ideology. Number 8, dispensing of existence. The group decides who is enlightened, who is worthy, who is safe, who is saved. The group decides who's doomed. The group decides who's in or out, and even like who's beyond help. And this last one is like particularly a nasty little gremlin, because that's where the group starts acting like it has the right to define your reality, your worth, and your future. Now, I'm not trying to rip on AA here, but when I read this list and I compared it to what it's like being in a 12-step program, it was 8 out of 8 for me, my experience. Every single one. It was like the playbook for AA. I could not look away from this. And it was such an eye-opener because I've never been a person to question. When I first started in 12-step rooms, people said, oh, AA is a cult. And I said, no, it's not. Don't be ridiculous. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And I went on and went to 90 meetings in 90 days. Oh my God, speaking of, Laura McCowan just shared a meme, something about you met me in my 90 meetings at a 90 days phase. And I laughed so hard because yes, that's a phase. That's like a part of my life where if you met me during that time, I was culted up and I probably was spewing all this doctrine and overriding what I thought, sacred science, like treating so much of the pseudoscience like it was the final truth. And, the confession part, always listing my defects of character, always talking about my part in it. And I was either going to be in or out. And I was deathly afraid of someone saying, she's not emotionally sober. She's out. She's beyond help. Let's get into this because this is particularly how it showed up for me in terms of AA dogma. There was pressure to accept one particular framework as the framework of recovery. There was a lot of fear-based messaging around leaving. There was a slow and subtle erosion of self-trust. And there was people parroting certainty instead of encouraging critical thought, curiosity, self-exploration, a lot of parroting of the same truisms. Repeated truisms. They were passed around like facts and loaded language, like I talked about, that it pathologized any normal emotion. Oh, that's your alcoholism talking. Everything is pathologized and loaded. So you feel gaslit in so many ways. You can't express how you're doing or how you're feeling or what's really coming up for you. And of course, if there's any real nuance around trauma or neurodivergence, gender, mental health, neuroscience, all that gets flattened, right? And what really started to mess with me was when I realized that the more curious I got, the more it was treated like danger. If I asked real questions, it wasn't seen as, oh, Kate's just being very discerning. It was framed up like she's spiritually off, she's resistant, prideful, selfish, she's definitely going to relapse. And that's not recovery. That's control dressed up as wisdom. Quick pause here, folks. If you've quit drinking, you're in early sobriety, no matter what that looks like for you, but you're still feeling bored or restless or struggling, wondering who you even are now, I want you to know that that is not failure. That's the middle. Now, some people call it the messy middle, but I call it the powerful middle. And I coach women one-on-one through the part that nobody talks about, the identity shifts and the emotional literacy and the rewiring. We are not white-knuckling. We are not performative. We are not good girl sobriety. We're having real conversations, real insight, real change. So if this is you and you're ready to stop circling the same thoughts and move forward, book a one-on-one call with me. The link is in my bio, or it's on all my socials at Rewired Sober, and I'll put it in the show notes. Because what I've seen is quitting drinking doesn't automatically make you more confident or calm or clear. It just removes the fucking anesthesia. So if you're sober and you're thinking, oh, cool, now I have all these feelings and zero roadmap, I work with women one-on-one to help build that roadmap. And we talk about boundaries and identity, and we talk neuroscience, and we talk about the stuff you don't say out loud. So if this hits, I'd love to see you on a private session. You're not confused. You're in a transition, and that's sacred. Midlife women in sobriety don't need more rules. They need clarity and confidence, and a fucking coach who won't gaslight their intelligence. So hit me up if you're interested. I'd love to meet you. Now back to the show. So I'm recording this as much for my own healing as yours, because it's so fascinating when you zoom out and you start to look at the research and you start to look at your own behaviors. Now, this podcast is not all about the cult of AA. You can make those decisions for yourself. I am so not here to tell you this or that, right? A lot of different recovery groups can get culty. But where I saw it also showing up in my life in a pattern sense was religious institutions. In fact, I saw it first in religious institutions before I saw it in 12-step rooms. And I really needed to unpack some of my religious trauma before I could even go there with AA. But it was kind of the same, it was along the same lines. The patriarchy disguised as morality, shame being used to control behavior. Questioning authority was treated like a rebellion against God, and it definitely obedience over discernment. You know, a lot of us women were taught that goodness means obedience. So when a system says to submit, don't question, stay small, trust us, trust this group, it can feel really familiar as women. It can feel even holy. So it's no wonder to me that organized religion, AA, healing circles, all of this, like I was a moth to a flame. I also kind of noticed this in the form of online spirituality girl groups, the spiritual healing version of a cult mentality is way more subtle, but it can be just as damaging. You're not told that you're sinful or broken, but more like it's on you and it's your low vibe, right? There's so much gaslighting. And even when it came to business coaching, there was a lot of hiding behind spirituality that business coaches would do. And it was basically financial exploitation. You were told that you're blocked or you're low vibe or you're in misalignment with your goals, you're being resistant or you're not manifesting hard enough. So now your own grief and pain is like a frequency problem for your business. Your real world struggle gets explained away as like bad energy or it's a bad mindset. I can't tell you how many business coaches I've had that leaned on the spiritual side and would tell me that it's my own mindset blocking, and their method was somehow never wrong. I was wrong. And it took a while for me to step back and go, wow, that's not empowerment. That's like spiritualized gaslighting. It's just teaching people to override your own reality in order to protect the fantasy or the system. So this was showing up for me in so many areas of my life. And, there's this funny truism that goes on in the coaching world that it's the cult of coaching because business coaches are obtaining clients, which are coaches trying to obtain other clients. And so the whole process is like this gaslighting system of you're not getting clients because your frequency is blocked or you're misaligned and as a person who really wants to grow your business, you buy into this and you pay these business coaches thousands of dollars to tell you it's your own energy. It's your own mindset. You're not showing up boldly and frequently and all these weird things. And, I go back to any area of my life where I was vulnerable and I wanted something really badly is when I got sucked in to the cult mentality. In the coaching and the online self-help spaces, there's a lot of guru worship. And, expensive proximity to the guru sold as transformation. You can see this in a lot of spiritual groups online. And anytime you criticize, it's like, oh, you're just not ready or you're blocked, right? And I have to reiterate that any space will get dangerous when the answer becomes trust me more than you trust yourself, because the personal cost is huge here. For me personally, a cult mentality in a lot of areas of my life, whether it be my recovery, my spirituality, religion, business, friends, money, whatever, the cult mentality has a tendency to, for me, override any ability for me to think clearly. And that's when I step back and I realize, wow, there goes my inner authority, because I notice it impedes like my peace, my emotional safety. Anytime something starts to hamper my self-trust, my identity, it starts affecting, there's my mental health. And especially if you don't feel inside like you have the freedom to change your mind. Personally, my biggest loss wasn't just bad information in a lot of these culty groups. It was losing touch with my own voice. It was that subtle split where I started checking in with the group or the group leader or the guru before checking in with myself. And that'll wreck your mental health over time because your nervous system knows when you're betraying yourself. Even if the group claps, your nervous system knows. And this matters because people join systems because they need relief. They need structure. They need belonging. They need hope. People don't get pulled into dogmatic situations because they're weak or dumb. They get pulled in because they're hurting. They're vulnerable. They want relief. And people certainly want to feel safe, especially when your life is on fire. The other day, I called my mom and I said to her, look, I've been on this process of deprogramming from patriarchal religious structures, organized religion, and deprogramming the dogma of AA. And then I realized it was showing up in my friend groups. And anytime you start to track a pattern, it's like, ooh, okay, it's me. I'm the problem. It's me. No, I'm kidding. But I really wow, I've been in this pattern almost since high school. In high school if you're in a friend group, like a clique, and there's the queen bee, and he or she will decide what foods are cool, what restaurants you like. You have a tendency to wear the same types of clothes. You listen to the same type of music. I was in one of those cliques in high school. And this clique I was in was big into sports and also big into being a good girl, right? No drugs, no alcohol, no sex. And it was like this fake repression because we're freaking teenagers. We had hormones. We're human. So it was just dumb. It was like the secret lives of Mormon wives. But when I step back from that and I see myself in that, I actually realized maybe I started drinking in my mid-20s as this form of radical rebellion against my high school cult, right? But then I find myself in these friend groups as an adult. Now, I've talked about this. I've recently separated with some friends in sobriety because of leaving 12-step rooms. And I've separated from sponsors who were my besties. And one of the commonalities I see with me separating from these friend groups is there's a lot of overlapping culty type qualities. There's a lot of loyalty tests and unspoken rules. I was in a sober friend group that really the leader was using gossip as social control. And we all thought she was our bestie because she was coming to all of us gossiping about the other person in the group. And we all thought, oh, she comes to me because I'm her best friend, not realizing it was a form of some weird social control that she was gossiping about all of us. And there was this pressure to perform a sameness to stay included. I was so afraid of being iced out if I spoke honestly about it. I showed up on a She Recovers meeting not too long ago, and I just said, you guys, I've lost so many friends, and I really am looking for a new friend group and all these things because it's really scary when you step back from your friend group and you realize, wow, this wasn't healthy. This was so toxic. And you see it kind of like high school. And so when I started to see this as a pattern for myself, whoa, pause, recognize holy shit, I'm doing it again. Of course, I'm going to unpack it with someone I trust, a mentor, my mom, and we're going to laugh. But then I'm going to reframe and rebuild. And I was thinking about how much I've rewired my brain for sobriety. And I've also had to rewire a lot of the 12-step dogma and friend group dogma and religious dogma. And it follows some of the same cadence of, you recognize the pattern, you need a hard reset, repattern, and reclaim areas of your life and unpack all that shit. So if belonging to something, someone, some group, some belief starts costing you your mental health, your honesty, your sense of safety, pay attention. Let's look at some red flags you can look out for if you start censoring yourself to stay accepted. And only sometimes if you're doing this. If deep inside you feel afraid to ask questions and especially in personal development, self-help, spirituality, whatever it is. If a big emotion is pathologized, that's a red flag. If the group acts like it has the only truth, oh, fucking run. That's a red flag. If leaving the group is portrayed as dangerous, shameful, or that person is doomed, red flag. It's a red flag if your relationship becomes conditional on compliance or your own instincts are constantly overridden. If you start to feel more dependent than empowered, and especially if you're told to ignore any evidence or context of your own lived experience, red flag. And that can be really scary, right? I did an episode not too long ago with my friend Kirsten, who is at the Sobriety Bestie, and we talked about death threats coming our way from speaking out against AA. I mean, talk about scary. Some people are so indoctrinated, and it bleeds into your own thought of yourself. It can be mentally exhausting. And then when you try to climb out of it, you're left in like this shame cycle and you're feeling very alone. And so when my friend Kirsten talked about deprogramming, I was listening up because that, was something that I conceptually hadn't really looked at before. And for me personally, deprogramming is asking better questions and being able to tolerate uncertainty within yourself and learning the difference between support and control. And that can be hard, especially when you think people love you. You're going to grieve there. You're going to grieve the loss of belonging and certainty. And for me, my deprogramming was rebuilding a lot of self-trust and allowing things to live in the gray area, allowing complexity. I've said before, I used to be so rigid and everything had to be black and white. But these days, I've learned to sort of reclaim my own discernment. No group gets to own my mind, right? I recognize that because the whole concept of deprogramming is not just leaving a system. It's noticing the system that got built inside of you, the messaging, the automatic obedience, fear, right? The fear of being wrong and the need to be approved of. And the reflex to call your own intuition dangerous. I know when I started talking about neuroscience and 12-step rooms, that was dangerous. And then when I started talking about it online and doing my own research and speaking up and talking about how your brain can rewire, that felt dangerous. My own intuition? No, red flag. Now, something I certainly need to bring up here is community, right? When we are in recovery spaces, community is one of the most important things in finding a like-minded group where you can be honest and share your struggles and hear me too. And you'll hear this impressed upon you a million times in early sobriety. Throughout any kind of journey that you're on, that's going to be a process. You need a community around this. So how do we form a community without getting sucked into cult mentality? And also, this is an area where I've learned to have a lot of compassion for myself because I desperately needed community in the beginning. And so it was easy for me to slip into this in early sobriety. It was easy for me to slip into it in early formation of my business, even in areas of high school or romantic relationships, right? And what's underneath all of that? Underneath that is vulnerability. I was in a vulnerable place in my life and time, and there was a lot of self-loathing. My drinking and my disordered eating had already done such a number on my self-trust. So it's no wonder when a group or a leader or a relationship offered me some certainty and community and identity, it felt like relief. Now, this is not to say that community is not helpful because it really, really is. And I want to impress that upon you is that I am pro community, but watch for the red flags, be discerning and trust your own instinct. Women don't get pulled into a controlling system because they lack intelligence, right? They get pulled in when they're hurting, when they're ashamed of themselves, when they're uncertain, they feel lonely, and they're hungry for belonging. And if you already distrust yourself, like anyone offering you some certainty can feel like salvation. As a feminist, I look at this and I also realize a lot of women are socialized to confuse self-abandonment with love, with obedience with being good and being chosen, being worthy. So when a relationship or a group dynamic or friend group or whatever rewards you and rewards that compliance, gives you identity, it can feel really seductive, especially if you feel really, really broken. And so when I first started stepping back from this, I thought, why am I a smart, capable woman falling into this pattern? Like I said, in early sobriety, early formation of my business. And I think if I get really granular on this, because uncertainty is brutal, whether it's early sobriety, early business formation, adolescence, heartbreak, identity change, grief, or any of those in-between spaces, uncertainty is fucking brutal. And you want answers and structure and belonging. You want a roadmap. You want someone to tell you what's true and reassurance that you're not failing. Because when your inner world feels shaky, certainty can feel like safety. So it's really easy for a group leader or ideology or a relationship to say like, here's the answer. Here's who you are. Here's how to be. Here's how to be good. Here's how to succeed. And we can fall victim to cult mentality that way. And women particularly are conditioned to look outside themselves. This is huge. Women are trained to be chosen, to be liked, to be good. Women are chosen, as Kathy Hilton would say, to read the room, seek approval, and we are certainly taught to not trust our anger, not trust our hearty, big appetites, our big ambitions. So when a system hands us identity, rules, belonging, and validation, it can feel really fucking familiar as a woman. Not healthy, but it's familiar. And that's why it hooks, and we women are so prone to shame, and shame makes authority really seductive. For me, deep down, I believed I'm simultaneously way too much and not enough. I'm a hot fucking mess. I need fixing. I ruin everything. I can't trust myself. I struggle with my alcohol. I struggle with my food, whatever it was I was struggling with. And my inner shame led me right into places of unhealthy authority. Any person or system that offers me correction, rescue, redemption, that felt really magnetic at the time, even friend groups, and I think for women, especially if you're carrying shame like I was from drinking or disordered eating or any of the things you struggle with, self-loathing, messy relationships, like fucked up stuff can feel really good. You're not in it because you're weak. You join in some way because part of you is just desperate to stop hurting. They say belonging is a hell of a drug. No, they don't. You know who says that? Oh my God, I can't believe I just said that. It makes me think about those clips that you see of Rick Jones, and he says cocaine is a hell of a drug. And he looks like tore up from the floor up. Anyway, belonging is really seductive. Back to my point. In sobriety and recovery spaces, we beat it into people to get a community. Don't do this alone. And rightly so, because community is powerful. And so is being seen. And, finally finding people who speak your language when you felt alone, the pull can be very strong. Just be discerning on where you go. Look out for those red flags, right? When you are in those vulnerable places. And, the reason I'm doing this whole episode is because, like I've said, community was like 99.9% how I got sober and stayed sober. But yet two things can be true. I had to get really clear on what my red flags were and my self-trust and discernment, so that later my spidey sense goes up when I see it play out in other areas of my life. I'm like the fucking Sherlock Holmes of cult behavior, because all this was so eye-opening to me. Intelligent women can rationalize a lot of things. And I did for a long time. I mean, honestly, sometimes smart women are better at getting trapped because we can explain away the trap really beautifully. We can intellectualize or justify or make meaning out of the dysfunction. Like I said, I'm the problem. Maybe I need to surrender more. I've heard really smart women in AA say, it's because I have character defects. I'm resistant. I'm not healed enough. I'm asking too many questions. Meanwhile, your nervous system's in the corner going, girl, this is fucking bullshit. So the kicker for me is when the price of belonging becomes self-abandonment, that's where the trouble starts. So today when I look for female social circles, when I look for spiritual circles or recovery spaces, I'm really focused on, what does my gut say? Can I be honest about how I feel and not feel like I'm pushing back against groupthink? Can I ask questions? Can I lean in and get curious? Certainly if they tell me there's only one path, you have to read a certain thing, use this certain language. I mean, all the red flags, they ignite my spidey sense. But in knowing what I don't want, I also am better at knowing what I do want. And when I'm in the right spaces with women, I can feel it. I can feel it as my nervous system settles. I laugh. I'm able to say what I think. Luckily for me, in the 8 years of my sobriety, I have now had more time in healing and safe spaces than I have in dogmatic ones, because I've been on this journey so long. I've been part of various types of recovery groups where there is no dogma. And I've gone through quite a bit of my recovery in a really healthy way. And I can push all that AA stuff way behind me. Now, I'm not bashing AA, but if you really, truly need help mentally, deprogramming AA because it has been harmful to you, I'm going to put a link in the show notes. Kirsten at Sobriety Bestie has an actual deprogramming AA process. And I'm certainly not interested in saying, oh, don't do it this way, do it this way. Right? We're not replacing one dogmatic group with another. We're not replacing doctrine with another. I'm not trying to say, this is the way you need to do it. I'm just interested in helping women come back to themselves, to think clearly, to stay curious, and to notice when belonging comes at their expense, and to stop handing their nervous system and their identity and their truth over to a system that can't love you back. So I hope this was helpful. It was kind of a ramble. This is tough to put into words, but stay discerning. Thanks for spending this time with me. I love you all so very much, and I mean it. You can find me on all the socials at Rewired Sober. The links to join my coaching program are always in the show notes, as well as an email if you want to get in touch with the pod. So until next time.